template here. I'm doing this video to help people figure out how to create realistic and authentic Chinese names. So this is especially designed toward people who are writing stories or maybe playing role-playing games or other games and want to come up with realistic Chinese names. If you are not one of those type of people, I still think you could probably learn a thing or two by listening to some of the information in the video. If you are looking for just a very quick way to come up with Chinese names, you can skip to the end of the video. In the last minute or so, I'll give some cheat methods to be able to come up with names rather quickly, especially for if you're not interested in coming up with a very complex or meaningful name, like for the main character of a story. If you just want to come up with some really quick names for side characters, go to the end of the video for that information. Before we get started, let's talk really quickly about how to write out the names, because as you know, the Chinese language uses characters, not letters and the alphabet. But there is a way to write out Chinese words in English, so to speak, and that's by using Hanyu Pinyin. Hanyu Pinyin is the method that the People's Republic of China has officially adopted to romanize Chinese sounds into non-Chinese character format. Every single sound and sound combination in the Chinese language is represented by a certain letter or sequence of letters. Just be aware that the way that you might think to pronounce it in English isn't necessarily the way it's actually pronounced in Chinese, but it tends to be a little bit close. So I suggest that when you write when you create names for your characters, I would very much suggest that you take the time to do a little bit of research and use the correct pinyin. That's the accepted standard nowadays. Throughout history, there have been multiple different ways of writing out Chinese into English and other languages. One of the really common ones for a long time was called the Wade-Giles method. And in that method, for example, you might see the letter combination TS a lot. And in Hanyu Pinyin, that is done away with, and you see C instead of TS. And there's just many ways in which they differ. But nowadays, for people who are familiar with Chinese culture and language, that Wade-Giles method is like, way in the past. So don't show yourself as being an amateur by using it. One exception would be if you have characters that you specifically want to sound like they're from a unique place within China. For example, South China, like Hong Kong, Canton area, or Guangdong, as it's more properly referred to. Chinese is pronounced differently down there, both in terms of their accent when speaking Mandarin and in terms of the local dialects. They're very different. And so sometimes the way that they pronounce their names would be different. So if you're writing a more, for example, modern story, or maybe even like a science fiction story, and you want to have that sort of like Hong Kong feel, then in that case, it might be better to not use pinyin. But for most purposes, I think pinyin is probably the best way to go. Now, really quickly, let's talk about the structure of Chinese names. I think most people who are even a little bit familiar with Chinese culture and language probably already know that the surname comes before the given name. That's the standard in Chinese culture. The family is more important than the self. Think of it that way. And so the family name comes first. So the surname, the family name, or the clan name is probably one of the most important parts of the name in some ways. And if you're unfamiliar with how Chinese clans work, I have another video I did where I talked about the sect and the clan in Chinese fantasy novels, and that's probably a good reference if you're unfamiliar with that concept. When it comes to the number of Chinese characters that are in a name, usually there are 2 or 3. Sometimes there are more than that. And I'll get into some of the details about how to come up with those kind of names later. But suffice to say that most of the time, the surname or the family name is 1 character, and then the given name is either 1 or 2 characters. Now, some of the times when that might not be the case will be when the surname, the family name, is a 2-character surname or family name, which they do exist. I'll talk about that more in a second. Another trend that I've noticed in modern China is that because of the fact that you're dealing with a relatively limited number of characters, and incidentally, when you think about it from the perspective of English, it might seem like Chinese is really complicated, and it is complicated. Don't get me wrong, it's very complicated. But there are actually a very limited number of family names. And then when you combine that with the fact that there are only a few thousand characters, it actually limits the number of unique names that you can come up with. And so in modern times, especially, a lot of parents are coming up with interesting and unique ways to make their children unique. I used to work at a school, and I would see the name lists of the students, and although I very rarely, in fact, I don't think I ever saw one of the traditional two-character Chinese surnames, what I did see was I saw children who had 4 characters in their name. And what some parents would do is they would combine the surnames of both parents, the mom and the dad, into a new sort of like quasi two-character surname, and then they would have 2 more characters to give their child a unique 4-character name. Or sometimes they would just take the surname as usually used, which would be the father's surname for the child, and then give them a 3-character name. I saw that on more than one occasion. Again, it's not extremely common, but it is becoming more common nowadays in modern China. If you're writing a traditional story, Wuxia, Xianxia, that's probably something you would want to avoid. But if you are writing a modern or a science fiction story set in the future, it's something that you probably could consider. Okay, let's talk first of all about surnames. Like I mentioned before, the surname or the family name or the clan name is very important, but in some ways it's also not important. Basically, when you come up with the surname or the family name or the clan name, you want to take into consideration who that family or clan is. Now, the reason I say it might not be important, one of the reasons is because if their background isn't important in your story, then obviously it really doesn't matter what their name is. You could just pick anything and it doesn't really matter. But generally, characters are going to pay a lot of attention to their family. And so you'll want to think about who their family is, where they come from. And now, the thing is, the actual meaning of the Chinese character itself is not very important. What I mean is, there are all types of surnames. And some of them, the characters mean something that's like really cool. For example, one of the most common Chinese character names is Wang, and that means king. So it's a like regal or cool sounding surname, but there are all kinds of people named Wang. You could have beggars who are Wang, you could have kings who are Wang, you could have prostitutes who are Wang, you could have assassins who are Wang, you could have street cleaners who are Wang. It doesn't really matter that the surname actually means king. It's just a surname. And likewise, there are some surnames which actually sound kind of bad, or even the character itself can have a bad meaning. Even sometimes the name, if used in the wrong context, could sound like cursing. One example that I thought up off the top of my head is there's a relatively common Chinese surname, and that is Zhu. And the thing is, although the character for that surname does not mean pig, the word Zhu, the exact same pronunciation, does mean pig. And so, kids who are surnamed Zhu in school might be made fun of more often than other kids. And even adults who have that surname, if someone's trying to insult them, they could use their surname in an insulting way very easily. But again, it's just a surname. So I wouldn't put too much thought into it unless you plan to make that a part of your story. In the fantasy novels that I translate, the author that I translate, Argun, he has a clan within multiple novels, and the clan name is Wang. And there is one scene in which it mentions the fact that surname means king. So if you want to draw those elements into your story, the actual meaning of the surname, that's fine. How do you pick the surname? Well, I'll have the link in the resources. I would just go to Wikipedia. They have a great page with a list of common Chinese surnames that includes the Chinese character and the meaning. So you can browse through those. The ones toward the top of the list are the more common ones, and it goes down from there. And pay attention to what the meaning of those characters is, and you can find a great surname very quickly. In terms of the 2-character surnames, like I mentioned, they are not as common. They were a lot more common in the past, and they've sort of faded away. There are still some that, according to my understanding, are relatively not rare in the modern world, but again, they're not very common. What I do find is that in the ancient stories, and especially the Xianxia stories, those 2-character surnames are used a lot more often. So if you're writing a true fantasy with magic and Taoism and things like that, you might consider throwing some of those into your story. They definitely add a more like ancient and cool vibe to your story. One thing I would be careful of, though, when you go to the Wikipedia page that lists all of those 2-character surnames out, take the time to look into the history of those specific two-character surnames, because some of them are very unique to a time period or a location or a group of people. And so because of that, it could come across as a little bit anachronistic to use it in your story depending on the context. All right, now let's go on to the given name. So usually with the Chinese names, you have the surname first, and then you have the given name being one or two characters after that. Now, when it comes to those two characters that make up the given name, it's like the sky's the limit. You can encounter just about anything that you can think of in Chinese. Obviously, the characters are going to be picked from the good set of Chinese characters. You don't want to pick something that sounds stupid unless you're going for that. How exactly do you pick these two characters? Well, what I would suggest is I would use Google Translate. So if you go to Google Translate and you type in some combination of words, it'll pull up the Chinese characters. It'll include the pinyin down at the bottom. Don't worry about the tone marks because you don't want to add the tone marks into your pinyin when you're writing in English. But pick something for the given name that you think embodies the essence of that character, whether it's a physical trait or a personality trait. Type that into Google Translate and see what it pulls up in Chinese. Now, what'll often happen is it'll pull up two-character words, and most likely you don't want to just pick that two-character word as the name, because usually they don't use common words as names. But what you can do is pull up that two-character name and then go into the reverse translate and then separate them by a line of text using the enter key, and then you can see what each one of them means. And if you click on it, it'll pull up an even more detailed definition, and then you can look in the bottom to find also other characters that are similar with similar meanings. And by using this method, you can come up with all kinds of different combinations of names. In terms of deciding whether or not to use one character or two-character name, it really doesn't matter. I think it's a matter of personal preference. Some people think that a Chinese name that has only two characters, a surname and a given name, is more like succinct and simple and powerful. But then again, it's harder to express a complex meaning with only two characters. So having a three-character name can give you a little bit more freedom to kind of mix and match the thought that you're trying to go with. One thing that you don't want to forget is when you're coming up with this name, make sure to keep track of which Chinese character it is that you're using, because there are many, many Chinese characters that have exactly the same pronunciation. And especially when you take away those tone marks, it becomes even more difficult to backtrack and figure out the Chinese characters that you use to come up with the name. And if you ever want to show it to a Chinese person, or if you're going to get an artist to depict it and for some reason you want the Chinese version of their name in there, you really want to make sure you have those Chinese characters on hand. I would suggest that you try to track down a person familiar with the Chinese language that you can run your name by. The thing is, no matter how much you try to get it to be authentic and cool, if you don't speak Chinese as a native language, there are things that you just might not notice. And I can speak from experience because, I write my own stories with Chinese characters in them. It gets confusing whether or not you're talking about a character in a story or the Chinese calligraphy character. Anyway, I try to come up with my own Chinese names, and then I'll take them to my wife, who, she's native Chinese, and it's kind of hit or miss. Sometimes I'll make up a really cool name and she'll be like, "Wow, you made this up?" And I'll be like, "Yeah." And then other times she'll just look at it and laugh, even though I think it sounds really cool. That's obviously not as important if you're only intending to show your story or have your character be presented to people who are not native Chinese speakers. But if you ever, think that perhaps people who speak Chinese might be reading your story, then you might want to go the extra mile to make sure that you've picked something that's really authentic. In that regard, I'm always open to help with this kind of thing. You can reach out to me on social media. Just say, "Hey, is this a realistic sounding name for a character in my story?" and send me the Chinese characters. And I'm not offering to help you make up all the characters for a huge cast of characters, but if it's one here or there, please feel free to hit me up. You can even leave a message in the comments of this video. I usually try to check the comments and I'll respond with that. Okay, so let's get to the cheat methods. There's basically two cheat methods. One of them is there are a lot of name generators out there. I'll give a link to one in the description where you can put in a little bit of information, and you can even base it on a Western name, and it'll pop up with a Chinese name that tends to be pretty authentic. I think that's a great tool for creating characters in games and novels. And another even more sneaky cheat method is all you have to do is go to Wikipedia and search for famous Chinese actors or people from Chinese history. Look at their Chinese name, take away the surname and replace it with a different surname and keep their given name, and then there you go. Most of the time you can come up with a pretty solid Chinese name. Now again, let me give a disclaimer there. You might run into the situation where you're picking a name that's very unique and that all the Chinese people would know and would be obvious even in the context of having the surname changed. So this is another situation where I'd recommend, if possible, have a friend that speaks Chinese take a look at it just to make sure that you're on track. Okay, so this is a really, really quick and dirty video about Chinese names. This is a subject which you could go on and on about. I'm sure you could write an entire book about the subject. So this is just a really brief overview. If you're really interested in creating unique and authentic names, please take the time to do the research. There are a lot of great articles on the internet, including on Wikipedia, that go into a lot of detail about the customs that go into name making and all the different aspects that you could take into consideration. Don't forget that in Chinese culture, the given name is not used commonly among people unless they're very close with each other. Like immediate family members will use the given name, and maybe other people who are very close, but almost without fail, people use the surname or the surname given name combination when addressing each other, unless they're very close. I'm going to get into in more detail on that and other things regarding terms of address and titles and nicknames and stuff in a future video. That's it for now. I will see you in the next video.